No wonder they say that angels play harps. That's just such a beautiful instrument. Every time you play, I wish it would never end. And today, particularly, because I knew when it ended, I'd have to come up here and speak. I usually sit back and wonder after the music ends, well, I wonder what the speaker will say today. Now I get to do that up front. I wonder what the speaker will say today. So I told a friend at work that I was giving a sermon today. I was hoping to invite some people from work to show up. He asked me the title, and I said, Love and Tithing. And he said, God loves a cheerful giver. I thought, that might have even been a better title. But I am a cheerful giver. Every week between Thursday night and Saturday, I sit down and write a check to Interfaith Center for Spiritual Growth. Yes, I write the whole title of the center. And then I calculate what I want to put in the check. And for a long, long time, I've been giving 10% of my gross income. Well, I get paid every 2 weeks, so it's pretty easy to calculate that. I give 5% one week and 5% the next week. If there's any bonuses, I'll include that in those two contributions. If there's any additional income, I'll figure out 10% and I'll put it into the next check. I get a pension, a small pension from a place I worked years ago, and I get that on the first of the month, and I'll divide that in half, 5% the first week of the month, and 5% in the second week. I know that sounds pretty OCD, but, I love the math, so I like doing it. And when I've finished, I pick up this stamp, and I stamp the check. It says, I was afraid I wouldn't remember it. I'm going to try to. No, to give is to recognize how you have received. And I stamp it with this stamp pad that's a multicolored stamp pad. If anybody has been involved in counting the money here at the church, they probably notice this curious little swirl that's on my check every time. Because I just love to put the stamp on. I got the stamp years and years ago when I, along with a number of people here, were in Unity of Ann Arbor. They were made available to anyone that wanted one by Karen Rodriguez. She's the deceased wife of Rod Rodriguez that maybe some of you knew. Anyway, I love this stamp, and I'm kind of amazed that after what's got to be 25 years, I still get ink out of this stamp pad, but it's great, and I love doing it. After I finish the stamping, I write in the lower left-hand corner, TYG, thank you, God, in the memo line. So I'm ready to give my check. I put it in this brown folder I carry with me, brown little notebook I bring with me every week to the service, and just wait for the basket to be passed around. So I love the whole process. Oh no, I love my contribution, but not as much as I love the process by which I contribute and what I've gained from the contribution. To talk about that, I realized there were 2 points of origin for today's message. I want to talk about the second one first because it was the most recent one. When it became apparent that anyone who had something to say could seize this pulpit, I said, I want to deliver a sermon on tithing. And I had some practice at it. Years ago, and when I was in Unity, I was asked to give a testimonial to tithing. There were about 3 or 4 other people who spoke on it, and I was one of those people, and it was very interesting, and I feel like I learned something from the experience. But being one of 4 people to give a testimony, it wasn't the same as giving a sermon. I thought, how can I possibly fill all that time? Well, for those of you who've heard me speak after other speakers at the end of the service and probably carry on more than you'd like, it probably didn't seem like a big stretch to fill the time. The other point that came from shortly after that was there was a meeting here which we call the quarterly conversations in community. And the one back in June, they presented some statistics and some information about the contributions. And they didn't use any names, but they gave different totals of contributions to the center. And I could be mistaken, but it seemed to me that I was the one who gave the most. And I thought, this is really bizarre. I can't be the richest person here, and I can't be making most money. How is it that I could be the chief contributor? My conclusion was, not everybody's gotten the message about tithing, so I got another reason to give a message about tithing. Well, one can't probably speak about tithing without going to the Bible, the original source of the idea, I think. And so I did that. I heard there was maybe as many as 25 citations in the Bible to tithing. I could only find 4, and a friend helped me with a concordance to the Bible, and those 4 popped up. The first one of those was in Genesis. Abraham gave 10% of his holdings to the chief priest and king of Salem, known as Melchizedek. The second one I found was in Numbers. That's the one that Esther's reading made reference to, because it was there that the Numbers, for those of you who aren't sure, is the 4th book in the Bible. It's where things are being laid out in terms of guidelines for the community of Israelites. And the 10% was to go to the Levites, who were the priestly class. They were Levites were one of 12 tribes, and the other 11 tribes were to put in their 10% to support the Levites. The third reference I found was actually in the New Testament. It was a situation where Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees and scribes. He was kind of going on about the false witness they had provided, and he said that you've provided tithes, but you have been stinting on justice and mercy and faith. That was found in Matthew. And the last one I found was in a letter from Paul. He brought up the image of Abraham and Melchizedek as part of his exhortation to give of tithes. And he urged that in the letter to Hebrews. So those were the ones I found, and I guess I'd ask the question, so are you convinced? Are you committed to tithe? Now that you're admonished to do so, are you going to change your behaviors? Well, if not, it might be that I haven't really sufficiently demonstrated the idea of love behind the tithing. And to get there, I really have to go to the first point of origin of my talk today, and that was takes me all the way back to 1980. The story begins with a contact with a woman in my past. For those of you who know me well, you're probably not surprised that there's a woman in this story. Her name was Annette, and for those of you who may be reading our newsletter, in the September issue of the newsletter, I make reference to a woman who helped me. The articles are on the construction of prayer, and the reference was to a woman who helped to bring me back from the darkness or grayness of agnosticism. I think I said this already, but her name was Annette, and I'll protect her by not disclosing her last name. But she helped me to see the importance of God in my life and rescued me from that experience of agnosticism. And she, like I, ultimately was looking for a church. So in early 1981, we went shopping for churches, and we found Unity of Madison, which we began attending regularly. We didn't stay together, obviously, and she eventually fell away from the Unity Church and went to another path, but I continued going most Sundays until I was ready to leave Madison. In 1983, I earned my PhD, and I did it in social work, and I did it with the expectation that I would get a job as academician anywhere in the country that would have me. I'd teach social work for the balance of my career. But I hadn't counted on two things. One was that I had never worked as a social worker, so what kind of credibility did I have to teach social workers? And second, I had what I came later to understand was a pretty significant drug problem, and it probably came across in interviews, I'm not sure, but I didn't get the job, and I wasn't sure, I felt unemployable. I wasn't sure what I could do. Got 4 degrees, I'm living in Madison. I was living in a commune at the time, kind of a hippie-esque lifestyle, and I had no particular plans. I was working some part-time gigs. I was making enough money to support my contributions or my expenses to the commune and live as a happy-go-lucky bachelor in Madison. After a couple years of that, in 1985, I looked up and went, you know, I'm 35 and I've never earned more than $10,000 in a year. This probably can't go on. I probably need to do something differently. It's there that I got the idea that I'd return to my native Michigan and began to pave the way to do that. But it was also at that time that I went to the Unity service and heard the message that really, I think, changed my life. The message was pretty basic. It said, God loves a cheerful giver. God will, anyone who gives their contribution to God's work will receive rewards. And that those rewards, some of them at least, will come about on this plane while we're still on earth. Well, I thought to myself, well, I've got nothing to lose. I'm not making much money, and I'm hoping God will back my venture to Michigan. Why not? So I started contributing 10% from my part-time gigs, and I continued my plan to leave town. I mentioned I was living in this commune. It was on one of the major thoroughfares of Madison. So I had a porch sale to get rid of all my hippie belongings. I was going to go live a straightforward life in Michigan. God knows if I've been successful in that. But, you know, I was going to give up the hippie stuff and sold it in a porch sale, kind of like a yard sale, but it was on the porch of the commune. And I even gave 10% of that to my weekly contributions. So anyway, I was ready to leave town and assume this straight existence and have faith in God that I would land safely. So I left Madison in August of 1985. Well, I left town with no job prospects and no money set aside for housing. Fortunately, my sister, Janice Pfeiffer, lived in Ypsilanti, and I moved in to her home with her family. She was kind enough to offer me a share in the bedroom with my nephew. I slept on the upper bunk, he slept on the lower bunk. He was 13 at the time, and I imagine he thought, how long is this going to last? Well, I also owed $500 to my sister Karen Mariashik in Florida. I'd borrowed that in the course of my graduate studies and hadn't gotten around to repaying that. So I thought, how am I going to move forward in life and repay my debt and get out of the cramped space I was living in and intruding on my family? And it's there that I think the tithing began to take off. Within 2 weeks of coming to Ypsilanti, I found a job. The job was overseeing 3 of the 7 homes owned by a woman by the name of Roberta Schrock. I say homes, she operated a group home business in Ypsilanti. And I was to, she saw something in my administrative education, which had happened before the School of Social Work, and the social work as well, and thought I could basically manage these 3 homes for her, for which she was willing to pay me the princely sum of $18,000. Now, some of you may be saying to yourself, $18,000 for a job of that magnitude? But remember, I'd never made more than $10,000 in a year before. This was like an 80% rise over whatever I'd made before. And it let me make a more substantial tithe. So I upped my tithe accordingly. And by October, I was able to move out of the Pfeiffer home and remain grateful to their tolerance of the intruder for the 2 months that I was there. And by December, I was able to repay my sister in Florida. Well, I won't get into all the intervening years, but there are some highlights I'd like to identify. By 1990, I had my job with Roberta had expanded to include an involvement with all 7 of her homes. And for this, she was willing to pay me $30,000 a year. Well, I was still tithing, giving 10% of that, and happy to do so. And the business, though, was beset by some licensing difficulties, and it was clearly going to struggle to survive. I convinced myself that my taking $30,000 out of the operation was an expense that she might be able to forego, and I took a leap of faith, claimed myself as a therapist, and began work as an outpatient therapist in my first job as a therapist in Flint, in an outpatient program associated with a hospital up there, for which they paid me $45,000. I continued to tithe. I did that job for a little over 4 years. They downsized their social work department and helped me to find another job in the elsewhere in the hospital. I wasn't too happy with the hours or the nature of that work, and I stayed long enough to earn 5 years of service, which is what entitles me to the pension that I mentioned earlier. And in October of 1999, I took a job closer to home. A little bit of reduction in pay, but a real reduction, because by the end of October, I was terminated from the job. I continued to tithe from the unemployment checks, confident that something would turn up. I tried my hand at being a contract therapist. It didn't work out very well, but I tithed from whatever money I made, so I was giving from that, and also giving from that, giving the 10% from the work I did, giving from unemployment. And of course, back in those days, some of you might recall there was a phenomenon where they paid real interest to hold your money in banks. So, yeah, right. Anyway, that was my tithe for the time, and it was in June of 2000 that I landed a job, my first outpatient substance abuse clinical job. I was grateful for the job, glad to be able to increase my tithing. I was a little bit of a rub because it was almost enough to live on, but not quite. There were times, I don't think in the whole time I was there, did I ever work only 40 hours a week. Sometimes they paid me for the additional hours, sometimes they didn't. When it was clear they weren't going to, and not for the foreseeable future, I took a couple of part-time jobs as a therapist on a contractual basis, and I tithed from those as well. Well, the whole thing kind of crashed down in 2008 when they let me go. And I went back to tithing from my unemployment checks. I'd only been out of work about 3 months when I got my next job. And then about a year after that, in October of 2009, I took a job where I currently work. And the beauty of that job is I have great coworkers, a great boss. And if you're watching this on video, you know who you are. But also, it was enough money to be able to just work the one job and give comfortably of my 10%, and that's kind of where I am today. What lies ahead is next month, I will turn 70, and I've already filed for Social Security, so starting in December, I should get an additional Social Security check. As long as I continue working, the two will combine to pay me or give me about $90,000 a year, and I intend to give more than $9,000 to the center next year. Hold the applause. There's more to my story. To some extent, this is kind of where I thought the story would end, but I want to cite one important influence I got. It was through Unity. There was a Unity minister, who wrote a book called The 4 T's, Tithing of Time, Talent, and Treasures. Some of you are nodding. I can see you recognize the title. You might have been part of the study groups that they founded at the time in the early 90s in Ann Arbor. Just examined the theory behind this, and I was pretty influenced by it, and I recognized that the gist of his message is tithing is not just about money. It's about giving of your service, giving your talents, giving your energy to the causes you believe in, the religion you profess to hold as your own. And it really struck a chord with me, and I think from that time on, I began a pretty consistent pattern of volunteering. It's carried over when I came to the center. And the time I've been here, I've been on the board. I was part of the first abortive attempt to coordinate the hiring of Dave's replacement. Craig knows about that one. I've also been on the leadership team. I've been a volunteer coordinator for 2 different stints. I've been a greeter, headed up the welcome table. I just remain committed to give back. Well, this really was all I intended to say until I went to Madison in May of this year. I stayed for a week, and about 3 of those nights I stayed with the lovely Annette. And I shared with her proudly and somewhat arrogantly, I suppose, that I was going to deliver this message in a sermon. She wasn't thrilled. She didn't really like the tone of the message. She suggested that I was probably too involved in telling what it gave to me, why I tithe and what came back to me. She had a different perspective, and she offered me 2 key points I'd like to share with you. One was that she saw her commitment to any organization, including religion, but also other causes she believed in, as being a function of commitment. And that commitment took 3 different stages. The first one was belief. Believe in the cause. Believe that the basic central message of the organization or the cause. Second, take action. Do something to make changes, to make things happen in accordance with the beliefs that you're holding. Take action. The third one she mentioned was service, which builds on the first 2, and I think is basically distinguishable from the action because it serves the organization or the cause. It serves to maintain it, expand it, support its work. It may not be directed toward the ultimate cause, but it's about sustaining the vision, giving rise to the ongoing program or religion. And she emphasized that that was the basis for her commitment, and it included financial contributions, because if it's going to survive, it needs your money as well. So that was her basis for giving of her contributions to the organizations she believed in. The second point she made kind of picks up on some of what was mentioned in Esther's reading. She felt that it was pretty destructive to urge people who are having struggles meeting the basic necessities of life to ask them to give 10% of their funds. And she had a different way of viewing it. She believed that nothing should interfere with people meeting their basic necessities: food, housing, utilities, transportation, most household and educational expenses. Don't ask people to cut into that. That's their money, and they need it to survive. Asking people to give that to any cause is really unfair and unreasonable. So she had a different way of calculating what she contributed. She saw it as a matter of giving from her luxuries. If she spent money on luxury, she would match that in terms of her contribution. So if she went to the show or movies and went out for dinner afterwards and spent $80, she put $80 into her contribution. If she bought a nice necklace and earrings for $120, she'd put $120 into the contribution. So her final determination of her contribution was based on what she spent on luxuries. Moreover, coming to the conclusion, I'm sure some of you have been waiting for that. I wrote this out, so I'd be sure to get every word of it right. I'm sorry, it's taking me. She was convinced that her commitment kept her from foolish extravagances, and yet never made her feel that she was depriving herself of the necessities of life. In general, she felt that she was honoring her commitment to a cause or institution in which she believed at no great personal sacrifice. Well, I conclude. There were two models of tithing presented. You are free to choose one or the other, or create one of your own. I only ask that you consider how best to love your tithe and be a cheerful giver. I was struck by the song that was selected for today. I was thinking, of course, about this talk, and I noticed this line from the song: "On the road from greed to giving, love will guide you through the dark night." So let love guide your tithing, and Annie, take it away.